Nobody could understand how a man named Ethan Mercer kept driving a truck that sounded like it was begging for mercy every time it turned a corner. 5 different dealerships had looked him dead in the eye and basically told him the same thing: the transmission was gone, the repair bill would crush him, and if he was smart, he'd give up and finance something newer. But Ethan wasn't some guy with endless savings. He was a single dad barely keeping everything together, juggling overtime shifts, school pickups, overdue bills, and a son who depended on that truck for literally everything. What nobody expected was that his last desperate stop would be a forgotten little garage sitting behind an abandoned diner, owned by an older mechanic people had quietly stopped believing in. Bro, when I first heard this story, I genuinely thought I knew where it was going. I was wrong. Because what happened next didn't just embarrass 5 dealerships, it exposed something way bigger. 2. Ethan Mercer had reached the kind of exhaustion that didn't just sit in your body, it followed you everywhere like unpaid debt. Every morning started before sunrise, every night ended too late, and somewhere between overtime shifts at a warehouse and helping his 10-year-old son Mason with homework at the kitchen table, he kept convincing himself things would stabilize eventually. The problem was, life had stopped giving him breathing room a long time ago. His old pickup truck, a faded workhorse with peeling paint and enough rattles to sound like a loose toolbox on wheels, was the only reason any of this fragile system worked. It got him to work. It got Mason to school. It hauled groceries, moved furniture for side cash, and occasionally doubled as Ethan's temporary hiding spot whenever life felt too heavy and he needed 10 quiet minutes alone. That truck wasn't transportation anymore. It was survival. And survival started looking shaky the moment the strange grinding sound appeared. At first, Ethan ignored it because, honestly, what choice did he have? The truck hesitated between gears, jerked hard when accelerating, and sometimes made this ugly metallic whining noise that instantly made passengers uncomfortable. Ethan kept telling himself maybe it was old age, maybe bad fluid, maybe something small. That's exactly how people think when money's tight. You don't diagnose problems, you negotiate with reality. You start bargaining with disasters before they officially arrive. One weird sound becomes 3 weeks of, "it'll probably be fine." But eventually, after the truck nearly stalled in traffic with Mason inside, panic started replacing denial. The first dealership looked polished enough to intimidate people before they even entered. Bright floors, expensive coffee machines, smiling employees wearing perfect uniforms, the kind of place designed to make struggling people feel poor before anyone said a word. 3. Ethan explained the symptoms, sat nervously in a waiting room pretending not to calculate rent in his head, and waited almost 2 hours for answers. When the technician returned, the verdict landed like a punch: complete transmission failure. Replacement needed immediately. Thousands of dollars. Financing available if necessary. Ethan remembered staring at the estimate wondering if somebody accidentally added extra zeros. He tried asking questions, hoping for alternatives, smaller fixes, literally anything. Instead, he got careful corporate sympathy and subtle pressure toward trading the truck in. The entire interaction felt strangely rehearsed. Still, fear makes people obedient. Ethan drove to a second dealership because maybe confirmation would somehow make the nightmare feel manageable. Same result. Transmission dead. Urgent repair. Unsafe to drive. Massive cost. The third dealership somehow sounded even worse, with one advisor casually mentioning the truck was living on borrowed time, which, hearing that while already broke, had to feel like psychological warfare. Bro, hearing this genuinely blew my mind because every person who's ever struggled financially knows this exact feeling. The terrifying moment professionals start speaking like your only options involve debt you absolutely cannot survive. By dealership number 4, Ethan looked less like a customer and more like someone physically carrying defeat around on his shoulders. He stopped asking hopeful questions. He stopped pretending there'd be good news. Mason even noticed the silence. Kids always notice more than adults think. One evening while eating cheap frozen dinners, Mason quietly asked whether they were going to lose the truck. That question wrecked Ethan more than any mechanic report ever could, because suddenly this wasn't transportation anymore, it was security, stability, and whether his son felt safe. For dealership number 5 delivered the final emotional blow. According to them, repairs would cost more than the truck itself. One employee even casually joked that Ethan should know when to quit. Imagine hearing that after weeks of stress while trying to hold your life together. I genuinely couldn't believe that part, because sometimes entitlement hides behind fake professionalism, and people forget there's a real human standing in front of them. Ethan left feeling humiliated, angry, and honestly scared. He parked outside a grocery store afterward, just staring at the steering wheel, mentally calculating impossible numbers while wondering how many more disasters one person could absorb before completely breaking. Then something weird happened. An older delivery driver loading supplies nearby overheard part of Ethan's phone call and casually mentioned a tiny repair shop outside town. Not flashy. Not popular. Barely even open consistently. The place belonged to an aging mechanic named Walter Briggs, a guy locals used to swear by before giant dealerships slowly swallowed small garages alive. According to rumor, Walter was stubborn, brutally honest, and weirdly obsessed with fixing things other mechanics gave up on. Ethan almost laughed hearing it. After 5 dealerships, optimism felt embarrassing. But desperation changes people. And by the following afternoon, exhausted, skeptical, and expecting absolutely nothing, Ethan found himself driving toward an old garage hidden behind a nearly abandoned roadside diner, unaware that the next few days were about to expose something nobody saw coming. The garage looked like the kind of place people stopped trusting years ago. The sign leaned sideways like gravity had been arguing with it for decades, faded lettering barely visible beneath rust and dust. Half the parking lot had grass growing through cracked pavement, and an old soda machine near the entrance looked older than Ethan himself. 5 If somebody told you this place had shut down 15 years ago, you'd believe them instantly. Ethan almost turned around. Honestly, most people would have. After 5 dealerships confidently telling him the transmission was basically finished, pulling into a forgotten garage felt less like solving a problem and more like delaying disappointment. But desperation has a strange way of silencing pride. Walter Briggs didn't exactly inspire confidence at first either. The man looked tired, grease permanently stained into his hands, gray hair unevenly tucked under a worn cap, glasses slipping down his nose every few minutes. He listened more than he talked, which already felt different from every dealership Ethan had visited. No dramatic warnings. No expensive speeches. No rehearsed sympathy. He simply walked around the truck slowly, asked Ethan to explain exactly when the noises happened, then sat silently in the driver's seat listening to the engine like someone reading a language nobody else understood. What happened next genuinely caught Ethan off guard. Instead of immediately declaring disaster, Walter frowned and muttered something that sounded almost annoyed. Not worried. Annoyed. He popped the hood, crawled underneath the truck for nearly 40 minutes, disappeared into the garage twice, and came back shaking his head like something wasn't adding up. Ethan stood nearby expecting the worst, mentally preparing for another financial collapse speech, when Walter finally walked over wiping grease from his hands and said something that completely scrambled Ethan's brain. The transmission might not even be the real problem. That single sentence changed the air. Because according to Walter, several symptoms didn't make sense together. The shifting hesitation. Real. Grinding noise. Concerning. But certain patterns felt off, almost exaggerated, like multiple smaller failures were pretending to be one catastrophic issue. 6 Walter explained that sometimes sensors, linkage problems, contaminated fluid, or neglected components could create behavior that looked terrifying without actually meaning total failure. And bro, this part blew my mind because Ethan had just spent weeks hearing certainty from professionals, yet the first guy willing to slow down was suddenly questioning everything. Still, Walter wasn't celebrating. He looked irritated, suspicious even. He wanted more time with the truck. More inspection. More testing. His exact attitude felt unsettling because he wasn't acting like someone solving a mystery, he looked like someone noticing something deeply wrong. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Late that afternoon, Walter called Ethan back into the garage and quietly pointed towards something sitting on a workbench: paperwork, diagnostic printouts, and service notes Ethan had left inside the truck from multiple dealerships. Walter had spent time reading them. And according to him, something about those reports didn't sit right at all. By the next morning, Ethan barely slept. Anxiety had turned into confusion, and confusion was somehow worse because now there was a tiny, dangerous thing called hope floating around in his head. Walter had spent the night digging through the truck piece by piece, comparing dealership diagnostics against what the vehicle was actually doing, and the deeper he looked, the stranger things became. Several expensive recommendations suddenly looked wildly exaggerated. Some listed failures weren't matching physical wear. Certain tests appeared incomplete. And one especially alarming detail made Walter visibly irritated: parts flagged as catastrophic showed signs of functioning far better than anyone claiming total failure should have expected. This part honestly felt unbelievable because Ethan had already emotionally buried the truck 5 separate times. 7. Walter went further. Instead of replacing anything massive, he traced pressure inconsistencies, cleaned neglected components, corrected a badly misread sensor issue, replaced inexpensive supporting parts that had quietly snowballed into chaos, flushed contaminated fluid, and adjusted mechanical linkage that had apparently been ignored for years. Hours turned into another full day. Ethan sat outside rehearsing worst-case scenarios anyway because disappointment had trained him not to trust optimism. Then came the moment everything snapped into focus. The truck moved. Not barely moved. Not temporary survival moved. It shifted cleanly, accelerated smoothly, and rolled through test runs without the violent hesitation Ethan had spent weeks fearing. Walter pushed it harder, checked temperatures, ran repeat tests, and somehow the impossible stayed impossible. The transmission, the terrifying monster every dealership practically sentenced to death, wasn't dead at all. Bro, imagine carrying weeks of panic, imagining debt you cannot survive, wondering whether your kid's stability is about to collapse, only to realize the disaster may never have been what people insisted it was. Ethan reportedly sat frozen behind the steering wheel, almost unable to process it. Relief mixed with anger in a way that honestly feels painfully human. But karma had one more chapter waiting. Because word started spreading fast after Walter documented everything, and suddenly those dealership reports weren't just embarrassing, they were raising uncomfortable questions nobody expected to answer. At first, Ethan didn't even know what to feel. Relief should have been the obvious answer, but after weeks of fear, humiliation, and sleepless nights, emotions landed strangely. Driving home that evening almost felt unreal. 8. The truck shifted smoothly, the terrifying grinding noise had faded into memory, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan wasn't gripping the steering wheel waiting for catastrophe. Mason noticed immediately. Kids always notice changes adults try hiding. The silence inside the truck disappeared, replaced with cautious excitement, and when Ethan explained, carefully, trying not to sound too emotional, that they weren't losing the truck after all, something about that moment reportedly hit harder than anything else. Suddenly the pressure hanging over their tiny household loosened. Meanwhile, Walter quietly did something nobody expected. Instead of ranting publicly or chasing attention, he documented the repairs, photographed worn parts, saved diagnostics, and laid out exactly what had actually happened versus what had been recommended. No dramatic accusations. Just facts. Calm, detailed, uncomfortable facts. That's exactly how real credibility works sometimes. You don't scream, you simply let evidence stand in the middle of the room and force people to look at it. Local drivers started hearing about Ethan's story through ordinary conversations, neighborhood posts, and people sharing experiences of their own. And suddenly, something bigger surfaced. Plenty of folks had stories about expensive repair recommendations that somehow felt suspicious after hearing what Walter uncovered. I genuinely couldn't believe how fast momentum shifted. The tiny forgotten garage behind the diner, the place Ethan nearly ignored, started seeing more cars pull in, while trust in certain polished promises suddenly looked a little shakier. For Ethan, though, the biggest win wasn't revenge. It was driving home knowing survival no longer felt impossible. 9. This is the part that really sticks with you, because it's not just about a broken transmission story, it's about how quickly people accept expensive authority when they're scared and overwhelmed. Ethan's situation shows how easy it is to be pushed into worst-case thinking when every professional voice sounds final and absolute. And honestly, that's what makes Walter's garage so interesting in all this: no pressure, no theatrics, just careful inspection and patience. Bro, hearing this just makes you realize how many people might be paying for certainty instead of truth. And that's the uncomfortable twist that lingers long after the engine noise is gone.